So I've tried to be subtle about this on my channel, but some of you may know that I'm actually a devout Catholic. But I came across some articles and some YouTube videos this week. I got to admit, they've got me shook, as the kids would say these days. They explain that Easter and then Christianity along with it is actually just like a derivative festival based on earlier pagan myths and celebrations. And for a minute there, I was ready to just abandon my Catholicism and become a devotee of like ancient Mesopotamian religions instead. It was really close there for a second, but then I did about like 30 seconds of Google research and discovered that pretty much all of the claims in those publications were actually fallacious. So I could breathe a sigh of relief. And as popular as those videos and those articles appear to be, it would seem to suggest that most people who come across them don't seem to know how to use a search engine. So I thought I'd save them the trouble and share what I found in my very thorough research. But before I just jump into it, don't you think it's worth asking why so many people fall prey to these tedious and easily debunked claims? I think it has a lot to do with like this genre of history media that is descended from an older, maybe more respectable lineage or version of like the History Channel, in which respectable historians were consulted and featured in historical documentaries. But that form birthed what is more common today, which treats history, and especially ancient history, like it's esoteric and mysterious, and that knowing anything about it is more like accessing arcane mysteries than anything else. Which is why we can make unfalsifiable claims about aliens in the pyramids or the lost cities of Atlantis and other such lost knowledge. This is then compounded by our own historical illiteracy, especially with ancient cultures, which is a sad fact when you realize that all the way up to the 20th century, grammar school students would memorize significant portions of ancient texts like the Iliad, authors like Boethius, and Platonic dialogues, so that the ancient world almost became like the air they breathed in grade school. And in a manner of thinking, it became something like a second nature to them. But we're so far removed from and ignorant about it that confident sounding presenters can come along and make these extravagant claims about it, and we're none the wiser. We can't defend ourselves against it, which has created a climate in which far-reaching speculation can masquerade as historically credible claims. And that seems to be what we're getting with the whole Easter is actually pagan crowd. So claim number one is that the word Easter comes from the pagan Anglo-Saxons who worshipped a springtime goddess named Eostre or Eostre, and then they tell us all kinds of details about this pagan goddess, that she was a goddess of fertility and new life and resurrection, and then they share several beautiful images of her, which is remarkable that they actually know so much about her. Because in reality, the only source we have that such a goddess was recognized or worshipped by the ancient Saxons is from a couple sentences in a very brief reference from a text about English months by the Catholic monk and scholar Bede. Now, I'd invite you to make a quick note of that. The only reason we know about this goddess is because Catholic scholars made a record of it for historical documentation. But if the entire Catholic religion was a fabrication plagiarized from these pagan myths, why would Catholic scholars, and in this case a Catholic saint, be so diligent in preserving their memory? Don't you think they'd try to hide that fact? And if Easter was a derivative of this pagan goddess, that means that knowledge of her by Christians would have to predate the practices and beliefs of Easter, because they can't copy another religion they don't know about, right? But we don't hear about this supposed Saxon goddess until Bede tells us about her in the 8th century, which is hundreds of years after Christians started celebrating Christian Easter. So it's sequentially impossible for this to be the origin of Christian Easter. And in fact, Bede's reference to her is the only firm historical source we have for this supposed goddess, and all he says is that she was worshipped in the Paschal month, quote-unquote Paschal month, so that when those pagans were introduced to the Christian religion, they kept the name of that month and translated Paschal from it. And the fact that Bede took the effort to know about this and document it should startle members of the whole crowd who believe that Christians conquered and destroyed and erased all the cultures they encountered. Contrary to that libelous stereotype, this is a perfect example of how Christian missionaries especially devoted themselves to understanding those cultures and even enhancing them if they could. For example, most of those cultures, the Anglo-Saxons included, had no recorded history because they didn't have an alphabet or written language to record it with. It was Christian missionaries who came there, learned their languages, sometimes constructed unique alphabets for them, like St. Cyril did for the Slavs, and like the Jesuits did for many Native American dialects. Christian missionaries made those records as an act of charity towards the peoples they encountered and lived among and had great affection for. But in order for the pagans of Britain to be introduced to Christianity and Easter, it must have been well established before any Christians learned about their gods and myths. So Anglo-Saxon paganism could not have inspired Christian beliefs or practices. But also, what was this word Paschal that Bede refers to? Well, it's the much more common and universal word used for Easter, and which predates the word Easter by several hundred years, which is why trying to claim that Christian Easter is derived from pagan myths because the word Easter sounds kind of like some of their gods is utterly untenable. Long before anyone had heard of Germanic or Saxon springtime goddesses, Christians celebrated Pascha or Pascha, which finds its origin in the Hebrew word for Passover, because the ancient Jewish festival of Passover is the actual origin and etymology of Christian Easter, not paganism. Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the promises of ancient Judaism. The Jewish Passover was a prototype and a foreshadowing for how God would liberate the entire world from sin and death, just as he did with the Israelites from Egypt. Pagan goddesses that we only know about because of Christian missionaries are not the origin of Christian Easter. So the next claim is, well, actually, Easter is based on the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, which is where we get the word Easter from again. Now, this claim I encountered in some of the exact same articles and videos which claimed that Easter was based on the Anglo-Saxon goddess Eostre. Okay, so which is it then? It can't be both based on Anglo-Saxon goddesses and Mesopotamian goddesses with entirely different etymologies and dialects and geographies and periods of history. So already we're contradicting ourselves, which gives us a pretty good indication that we're just frantically throwing mud at the wall, hoping that some of it will stick, which goes to show this isn't about a sound exposition of true history based on facts, but instead grasping at anything we can to try to discredit Christianity. That's the obvious aim here. And in fact, no scholar recognizes an etymological link between Ishtar and Easter. And again, long before it was called Easter, it was called Pascha, which is still the most universal form of it. In Latin, it's called Pascha. In Greek, it's called Pascha. In French, it's called Pâques. In Spanish, it's called Pascua. In Italian, it's called Pasqua. And again, these are all linked back to the Passover word in Hebrew. But in spite of reliance on that obvious urban myth, they aren't discouraged. They goes on to explain that Ishtar's myth is a resurrection story in which she goes into the underworld just like Jesus did. She's killed, and then 3 days later she's brought back to life. Some even go so far as to claim that she's crucified, although there is literally no documented evidence of that other than the naked assertions made in modern YouTube videos. And while some superficial similarities might be present here, the differences that are overlooked are significant. For one, Ishtar's reason for going to the underworld was to try to seize control of it. It was imperialistic and expansionist in nature. It was a power grab. When she fails, the only way for her to return is to substitute her life for another, so she condemns her husband, Dumuzi, to that same fate and escapes. Her story is about self-interest, conflict, and throwing other people under the bus because of her recklessness. The story of Christ Jesus, on the other hand, is one in which he sacrifices himself for the good of others. Those two things couldn't be more dissimilar. Further claims about her are made regarding eggs and bunnies and such, although there are no depictions anywhere of her in this way. So that's pretty much, again, just made up to try to further establish a connection that just doesn't exist. But even if you could find pagan depictions of eggs and or bunnies in the springtime, so what? Christianity, and especially the celebration of Easter, isn't dependent upon those things. They were probably just later crept in, especially because of the economic incentives of chocolate producers. But nonetheless, similarities don't make two things the same or one dependent upon the other. Just because two things can coincide doesn't mean one caused the other. And what we find often with these comparisons are just vague, poorly researched, and fragile similarities at best. It's like saying, hey, this song over here has C, G, and F chords, and this other song over here that came later, it has C, G, and F chords. Therefore, That later song was just copied from the previous one, which is a textbook non sequitur fallacy. Or imagine a class of students all writing essays attempting to answer the same question, and then imagine their teacher who started grading them and noticed that they all have similarities and that they're all answering the same question, and then concluded that this must be a cheating conspiracy in which they're all copying one another. Obviously, that would be absurd and unfounded, but what we find in many religious traditions and myths is what happens when we try to explain and understand the same questions. Questions like, what is our origin? What is ultimate reality? What is our ultimate destination? And what is the purpose of it all? Naturally, you're going to get a lot of answers that share some details in all of that. It's somewhat unavoidable. Does that mean that every answer is just a copy of all the others? Of course not. Furthermore, if similarity proves contingency, which is what they seem to be arguing in all of these articles, then variation or difference would prove independence from one another. And what we find with Christianity, and especially older ancient myths, is that they have far more difference than similarity. And if you don't believe me, just look to the ancient pagans who first encountered Christianity and found it so foreign to their sensibilities that they often responded to it with literal violence. This is especially true of ancient Rome, which wasn't typical for them. The Romans were famous for adopting the gods of the people that they conquered and incorporating them into their pantheon. This practice was known as syncretism. But both Judaism and Christianity were so exotic that they couldn't figure out a way to blend them into their religious devotions. Not only were they strange to their sensibilities, but in the case of Christianity, it was often extremely offensive to them because crucifixion was seen as like a horrifying indignity, which is why the Romans used it to control the populations that they conquered. The idea of worshiping someone who was crucified was so repugnant to them, but that all they could do in response to it was ridicule them, proving that Christianity was extremely unique and unfamiliar to that pagan environment. Which, if it was so easy to trace back to prior pagan myths, it wouldn't have clashed as dramatically as it did with the Greco-Roman world. Okay, everyone, thanks as always for watching that. I need to share an update for those of you who routinely watch my channel, because I recently found out that that is refusing to recommend my videos in the algorithm because of my past defense of church teaching on certain, I have to be subtle here, like multicolored alphabet topics, which means I need your help more than ever to help me spread good Catholic content. Make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell to know when these videos are released. And if you can, like, share, and comment, that helps nudge us back into the algorithm. And if you want to help in other ways, you can join my locals community where you can interact with myself and other like-minded people. We're also doing a monthly philosophy study with myself and a Thomist professor of philosophy. And seriously, how many opportunities are there for that kind of formation? It's been great, speaking from my own experience. So you can join at brianholdsworth.locals.com, or if you want to contribute in other ways, you can go to my website at brianholdsworth.ca/help.